So yeah, good morning. I came to see you because days after days, weeks after weeks, we see crises everywhere. One day it's World Trade Center, another day it's Madrid, or the SARS, or the BSC, and it's high time not to go back to what is it? What is this phenomenon? We are not used to tackle that collectively. And you spend your life working on that. You created a center years ago to work on that and say, look, it is not only natural disaster, it is not only the missile crisis in 1962. We are now faced with multiple level crises, and we have to study that. So I came to you because you were the first in the world to set up such a center and to develop a theory of these crises. So perhaps what did you do, and your key points, key messages?
Okay. I started as a professor of government at Leiden University, and in that capacity I did a lot in analyzing political stability, political order, instability, violence, etc. And in that time already I was intrigued with the fact that you could talk there especially about the way in which populations, governments, etc. Could be or were not able to be resilient to all kinds of threats. For instance, all days political science and violence. Now, at a certain moment, I started to become interested in events which were apparently coming as a surprise. And at a certain moment I noticed that there were a lot of bodies of knowledge which were separated from each other, like the body of knowledge studying natural disasters. There was a body of knowledge on international crises, especially nuclear crises, with the over-researched case of the Cuban Missile Crisis as the cause célèbre. There were many people who were studying revolutions, and especially revolts and riots in society. There were also people who were studying, for instance, starting to study for instance, crises which could bring out of pace private corporations, business crises. Now, at a certain moment, I had the feeling that all these seemingly different bodies of knowledge were actually about one thing. They were all about threats to their system or structure or to their fundamental values. They were all about the urgent feeling of those responsible to do something about it, because if you don't do anything about a severe threat inflicted upon you, you are simply dying off. And they were very, very interestingly about uncertainty. And that is to say that there are those who need to do something about something very seriously, but they don't know exactly what it is all about. Well, then I coined the phrase crisis for these sort of events. And I've worked my way with this vocabulary. I have developed throughout the years a number of, call them propositions, on what may happen if people are faced with these sort of crises, a wide variety of crises, including including also cases of terrorism, for instance. And at a certain moment, and it's not so long ago, I've decided that we should add to these three characteristics, threat, urgency, and especially uncertainty, where I don't talk about surprise, because always you see that somebody will suddenly say afterwards that he or she had predicted what happened, and unfortunately people didn't listen to him. So uncertainty. I've added to the three of threat, urgency, and uncertainty a force which is unimaginability, unimaginable, inconceivable, and the strong urge to do so was already present with a lot of people throughout the 90s, when already things happened which they didn't think about beforehand. But of course, this has gotten a increasing impetus by the 9/11 event in New York, which nobody had ever expected to happen, and suddenly it was there.
One point in common on all that is you accepted theoretically and in your practice to go outside of the box. If you say that inconceivability is something you have to tackle,
yes,
it's exactly what you wrote that somewhere, that social science and science in general doesn't like so much crisis, because crisis is something abroad, outside.
Yes.
And
yes.
saying I'm going to work on that is
Yes.
a first act.
Absolutely, you're quite right in that. Especially with you as a scholar from France, where Descartesian logic is at the center of intellectual thinking, I would say that especially if you embrace Descartesian logic, it's very difficult to accept that you could more or less, in a disciplinary way, scientific way, study and examine events which seem to be totally at odds with Descartesian logic. And of course, it was not a surprise to me, if I use that word surprise, that when you started to work on it, were using the phrase risque majeur, major risks, because there at least you can reconcile with Descartesian logic through probabilistic kind of approaches. But for me, crisis is a sort of, originally at least, was a notion, a sort of phenomenon which is on the other extreme of the continuum, and which resists probabilistic and statistical lines of thought in many ways. And to make it more clear, I do not take a great interest, for instance, on my part, others do, in calculations and computations where people say that the chance for something to happen is 0.0 and then you have to the 9th power. I don't work with that sort of approach, because it tries to explain or to explore crisis events in a manner which is not intrinsic to the substance of the matter.
So your first message perhaps is look, there are many things outside, and if you don't look at them, they will look at you rapidly. So train to do that. And one case study you looked at very carefully was with the Moluccan hostage takers in the 70s, where you showed that the hostage takers learned a lot between the two.
Absolutely.
And, this is
absolutely. During these events, the terrorists made a very big mistake, you might call it, extraordinary in those times, because they killed right away two of the hostages. After about 2 weeks, the Dutch authorities talked them down and out, as we called it. And the Dutch authorities then took great pride in what they called this showpiece of the Dutch approach, a sort of psychiatric, psychological approach to hostages, to hostage takers. Now, if you would consider what actually happened then, it was the terrorists did something irreparable. They killed two of their hostages in cold blood, and they were talked out of the. They were talked out, spent their time in prison, but that was it. Now, in 77, again a group of South Moluccan terrorists, much tougher than those of 75, took hostages again at two places simultaneously in the north of our country. They had learned a lesson. They said to each other, we will not have it happen again that we are going to be talked down and out. We will hold out in the most tough way. And if we want to hold out as long as possible, we will, in any case, not kill hostages. So they took great pains in not doing something irreparable to their hostages. And while the authorities took it as a message that they were softer than their colleagues in 75. And what happened was that these terrorist attempts in 77 dragged on, not for 10 days, not for 14 days, but they went far in their third week. And at a certain moment, the authorities only then understood that these terrorists were not softer, but they were much tougher than their colleagues of 2 years earlier. And then the authorities, in a way, stood empty-handed. And the only way they could end this terrorist attack was by attacking the terrorists, and it was a bloody affair after, eventually. So the lesson is that the terrorists learned their lesson much earlier and in a more intelligent way from what happened in 75 than the authorities. The authorities thought in 77 that they could do it the same way as in 75, while actually the terrorists had learned that they should change their behavior, not making mortal victims, and by that, in that manner, would make it the authorities much more difficult to intervene. So
the problem is that it is very, very difficult to learn on that, because as you say, there is a psychological dimension. To learn, you have to accept discontinuity. You have to accept to go outside of the box.
Sure.
So it's very near to your theory, which is it's not so easy for social scientists, for scientists, for rational people to enter this world. And as you say, if this world is not some tiny part of the universe, but go to the core of the problem of the world today, then we have a big challenge.
Absolutely, and I would say that it is enormously important whether a crisis unfolds because of developments, natural development, developments which are not coming out of the bad will of people, or whether it is whether they are events which are imposed upon us intentionally. In both situations, you have to especially when there are situations where people are involved, you have to be able to understand the intrinsic logic of these events, and this intrinsic logic is totally different, maybe totally different from the logic you are using to explain them. And to give you an example, if we look for instance at terrorism today, whether you like it or not, you can't impose your Western standards of logic on those who don't accept this Western logic or are totally alien to it. And you have to place yourself, if you can, into the mental state, into the mental state of mind of those who try to inflict harm upon you. And if you do so, you may find a sort of rationality and a sort of logic in the heads and in the actions of your quote-unquote enemies, which is totally different from yours, but nevertheless is a rational and logical reality by itself.
It seems to be the grammar of any type of crisis, because even with BSc you don't understand, because it is not normal that any problem goes from an animal to a human being.
Sure.
It was not the rule, and it's the key thing I think in crisis. It is not the rules we are used to.
Sure.
So perhaps if you had to teach, to train people, the first rule could be open to other rules and clarify what is in your mind. Sure. And try to find something else outside.
Sure.
To be open.
Sure. And I could my most straightforward answer to this kind of puzzle is that whether we like it or not, let me say it in this way, many crises, we call them like that, but they are by now more or less in the box. In some way, you might say that for that reason they lose their critical dimensions. The genuine crisis is an event or a development which takes us in that way by surprise, that the tools we have at our disposal do not meet the essence, the intrinsic qualities of the problem which we are facing. And we have to think new ways, we have to reflect upon thoroughly before we can act upon them. And for that reason, one of my messages in general to people who are exposed to genuine crises is that they definitely have to reflect thoroughly before acting upon it. Because if you act upon it without knowing what actually is going on, And if you don't have at your disposal standardized procedures and rules and instructions to cope with it, you may contribute to a deterioration of the situation instead of containing it.
Mm-hmm. And what you say is try to understand the other logic.
Absolutely.
Working in that, because if you don't understand the other logic, you are going just to apply your logic and you are going to crash.
Absolutely, absolutely. And for instance, with regard to the new terrorism, as we call it today, we have to accept the fact that some people may make use of our Western quote-unquote methods and techniques and our technology, but they do it for reasons and to realize objectives and aims which are totally at odds with ours.
And now, if you were in charge of a sort of school of government, because the impression is that people in charge will discover that their tools do not work anymore. The grammar we have doesn't seem to fit with the challenge. If you had to train these people, what sort of things you would say and the approaches you would develop to have another approach to governance and
yes. For me, one of the most important features is actually that we should learn to think in what the Americans call futures multiple. In my country, the funny thing is that our vocabulary has only the singular form future, which compels upon you a sort of deterministic way of looking ahead. One of the biggest challenges in our educational programs is actually to train people to look at futures, at the different directions which may develop, to think also, if you want to hear about a sort of technique, to learn thinking in contingencies and to become more qualified scenario thinkers. And if you train people in that manner, you may also give them some sort of reassuring thought, because if you talk about scenarios, you may also talk about the possibility to intervene in those scenarios which you consider to be so ugly that you should do your utmost to prevent them from happening. Which is not to say that you then single out one scenario which you go for, but in any case you may try to put outside of you might try in any case to do your utmost to prevent the most ugly from happening.
So I try to work on developing creativity, multiplicity, agility,
absolutely,
and not the best in my square and the best in my level, the best in my professional specialty.
Absolutely.
And this would be your message for training people.
And I would say that at a certain moment, people who are trying to learn that may indeed sooner or later develop a sort of sensitivity. In German, you may talk about Fingerspitzengefühl, intuition, creative imagination, where they will see the adversity in certain kinds of developments sooner than others will do. And that's all it is about. And let me give you also an example of this. It also amounts to, for instance, the following pattern of reasoning. If you see that all cards are set upon countering one particular kind of threat, you should be open-minded and understand that the threat which may be inflicted upon you may be of a totally different nature. And you have always to balance the different modes of threat and crises. At this moment, for instance, we are only thinking about terrorism. But meanwhile, there may be totally different sort of threats which may also be developing. And you have to keep your minds very open for that. So keep the mind open. I would nearly say do away with not only with in-box, thinking in the box and out of the box, but skip the notion of a box whatsoever. Be as open as possible and try to understand that the futures may develop in very many different directions.
And try to find a sort of psychological balance in that.
Absolutely.
And not to be completely...
Absolutely. And one of the biggest problems we have, of course, and I don't need to tell you about it, but you have, because also you have done so many of these sort of studies, but we have to also understand how important it is to accept what you might call generalized learning. Our normal mode is to learn perfectly from the last event. The general winning again the lost battle of the war he fought. You have always to understand that if something happens, that you have to be very careful not to overreact, and to generalize, to go for a generalized outlook at what has happened throughout so many decades. And from there on, you can in any case say, well, there is more to this than only the last event. And besides that, you have to keep your mind wide open for the surprises which may be at hand in the future.
So this is the key message you would say to
people in charge. I would like to stress especially that it is very important to do away with the idea that if you are exposed to a crisis situation, and that's my message to politicians and to chief executive officers, etc. Be very careful not to give in to this over-popular mode of being the macho decision maker who immediately says, well, we go that direction. If they don't understand what is going on, this message may be a bigger crisis than the crisis they have, which is on the table. So think before you act. And a very nice experiment, which I've done sometimes with chief decision makers, is that in the midst of a severe crisis, I tell them, now stop, do nothing. And then I let them be silent. And after 30 seconds, I say to them, well, these were 30 seconds. And these 30 seconds look like ages. And there is a sort of embarrassment going through this group of the key decision makers, because they suddenly realize that in only 30 seconds you can reflect upon what is going on. And then you see how quickly the brain is working, and they may come up with totally new ideas and notions, and they indeed step out of the box, as you may call it, and they then suddenly understand how important it is not to give in to this macho idea that crisis management and coping mechanisms are with pushing the button and showing that you are the boss.
Exactly. What you say is crisis is discontinuity in a sense, inconceivability. And the way we react is always pushing the button and having the good answers. And what you do, saying stop for 30 seconds, it's just you let questions in.
Absolutely.
And then you have discontinuities, questions, and then you can be intelligent.
Absolutely. And in decision making, we talk about decisionism, which is the obsession with taking decisions. Now, the crises may often be very tempting to say, well, we have to take the critical decisions. I say, okay, naturally we have to take critical decisions, but do understand that if you take a critical decision at the moment that you don't know what is actually going on, that you may make things worse instead of better, improving them.
So please stop, think, question, and
Absolutely.
be open and see the different futures.
Absolutely.
And be flexible and work together. And this
Absolutely.
is your core
Absolutely.
message.
And my core message to those who are indeed involved in these sort of things is also based on, may I say so, a lot of experience in crisis situations, where I have seen with my own eyes that when something suddenly happens, for instance with us with a very large air crash in a residential quarter in Amsterdam, here in the Netherlands, what you see is that during the first hours, the people who are at the place, at the site of the incident, know very well what they have to do. These operational people, these people in the operations, in the emergency services, they know perfectly well what they have to do. They have to do what they have to do. And what the chief decision makers somewhere else have to do is to not to give in to the temptation to interfere. No, they have to stand back. They have to try to get information as much as possible so that they know what is actually going on, and they have to already prepare for what we used to call the crisis after the crisis, which is often much more severe than the critical event itself.
But if they are not so well trained, they will immediately try to do the job of the first on the scene, and it will be very bad.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely, and among those crisis events which really have gone out of hand are often crisis situations which start actually as a rather containable incident, which due to a premature intervention by the authorities became the big disasters we know about. One of the most famous examples, of course, has been the Sandoz chemical disaster many years ago, where the intervention with good intentions on the part of the people who were responsible for fighting it made it the big disaster it actually became. So there are a lot of that sort of examples, and it all goes back to my message: think before you act.
Thank you. Thank you.